Hello followers and welcome to my channel. Today's video will cover the pmdg 747-400 pre-flight procedure starting from cold and dark. So let's get started. I just loaded the aircraft and as you can see here, by default it's loaded with the engines running. Now I need first to set the pmdg 747 to cold and dark panel state, then I start my pre-flight procedure from there. For the cold and dark setup, we use the FMC CDU page. From the menu page, I select pmdg setup, panel state load. Finally, I select cold and dark, then execute. Loading panel state in process. This will take a few seconds to initialize the system to cold and dark configuration. And as you can see, now all the system is in cold and dark state. And I can see from the external view that the aircraft is chucked, engines off, perfect. Now, typically as any other aircraft, we start our flight with the power up procedure. First, I need to connect the ground power to the aircraft. Using my FMC CDU, I click and hold the menu key long enough to bring the CDU display to life. Then I select FS Actions, Ground Connections. Now on ground power select line, I select Request. This will connect the GPU to the aircraft. And if you are not using the APU for the air conditioning, you can use either the air start unit or air conditioning unit, and it's up to you. Let me select, for instance, the air conditioning unit. Now looking at the aircraft from the external view, we can confirm that our connections are established. Now I go to the overhead panel and check for available lights illuminated on both the external power 1 and 2 switches. Now, before I select the 2 switches to on, I need to do a quick check for some switches and levers to ensure that they're in a safe position. But I need the ICAS display during this check, so I have to apply a standby power using the battery. Right click on the battery cover to open the guard, then left click to turn the battery switch to on. I set the standby selector to auto. Standby displays come to life. Now I start this safety check with the hydraulic demand control selectors. They're all off. The wiper selectors are off. Alternate flaps selector is off. Alternate gear extend switches are off. Landing gear lever down and agree with green down indication on the primary ICAS display. Flaps and spoilers levers checked in their proper positions. Now I can safely select the external power switches on. Nav switch goes on. And we can initiate the IRS's alignment by rotating the IRS selectors to nav. Now from the display control panel, I select engines on the secondary ICAS display. Then I check for sufficient oil quantity. Then I go back to display control panel and select status to check for sufficient hydraulic quantity. Now if at this point of time you are about to start boarding passengers, you need to arm the emergency light. Now I can pre-flight my FMC, but in this tutorial I will do this quickly since I'm preparing another tutorial where I break down the flight planning and the FMC pre-flight in more details, so don't pay attention to what I'm doing here. This is just for the purpose of the sequence of this tutorial. As I told you in upcoming flight planning tutorial, I'll show you step by step how to program the FMC, including the flight plan, the performance. I will show you also how to derate the engines for takeoff and climb and many other tips. Now the FMC pre-flight is complete. I can start now the Preflight scan flow. Now I will start the scan flow from the overhead panel, and the flow will start at the left column from up to down, then the center column same thing from up to down, and the right column from up to down. Now I will start the flow. EEC switches normal, IRS selectors on nav, standby power selector auto, left and right utility switches on, APU leave it to off for now, it will be started just before engine start. Bus tie switches auto, generator control switches on with amber off lights on, drive disconnect switches amber drive lights on, the hydraulic amber indications all on, hydraulic demand selectors are off, engine driven hydraulic pumps on with amber pressure lights on, emergency lights guarded, OBS audio system normal, fuel transfer switch is checked off, the APU and engines fire switches in, cargo fire switches are checked off, start switches are checked in. Moving to the ignition controls, the standby selector normal, ignition continuous switch is off, ignition selector is normal. Moving to the fuel jettison control panel, the selector is checked off, the left and right nozzle control valve switches is safetied, the fuel crossfeed switches 2 and 3 armed, and the fuel crossfeed 1 and 4 are open. All the fuel control switches are off, the anti-ice switches auto, window heat switches go on, wiper selectors are off, landing lights off, runway turn off lights off, taxi light off, passenger oxygen guard closed, the yaw damper switches on. Moving to the pressurization panel, the outflow valves pointers in open position, the manual left and right switches are off, the outflow valves control switches is centered, the auto selector normal, passenger and flight deck temperature controllers set to auto, trim air on. Now for the recirculation switches, if we are using the packs we select them on, and if we are using the ground air conditioning unit we select them off. For instance, I'm using the ground air conditioning source, so I select them off. Equipment cooling normal, high flow and pack reset switches no need, the gasper switch is on, packs are off, and if we are using the APU or the ground air source we can turn them to normal. For instance, I leave them off. Isolation valves are open, APU bleed switch is on, engine bleed switches are on with the amber off lights illuminated, beacon switch off, nav switch on, strobe switch off, and the wing and logo switches can be used if the flight will be conducted at night. Moving down to the glare shield, I will set the MCP or mode control panel, starting from the left, flight director on, auto throttle switch armed. I will put V2 speed value in ISMAC window. My FMC has computed the V2 in the takeoff ref page, and it's 181 knots. 181 set. Now the heading can be set to the runway heading, or it can be the initial heading that complies with the departure procedure. For instance, I put the runway heading 52. The initial climb altitude, for instance, it's 15,000 feet. Set. The autopilot disengage bar is checked up. And we finish the MCP panel with the FO flight director switch selected on. Now moving to the FS panel, I select the minimums, I set the altimeter, then I set the other range and display modes as desired. Now moving down to the center panel, here I'm gonna start the scan from left to the right. The source selectors set to vertical position. We check the clock for correct time with the chrono in reset position. Both the inboard and lower CRT selectors normal. Now I move to my PFD and check the V2 value above the speed tape, 181, with its speed bug parked on the top of the tape. V1 155, ground speed display is 0. Moving up to the flight mode annunciator and check that both the roll and pitch modes are in toga mode. FD on. The crosshairs are checked with the roll bar centered and the pitch bar parked up to 8 degrees. Moving down to the heading indicator display, my heading is checked 052 in magnetic mode. My initial altitude is displayed above the altitude tape. And finally, the altimeter is set to the current altimeter. Moving to the navigation display, ND, I check two important things. The first is that the track is in magnetic mode and the active departure waypoint is correct with leg distance displayed properly. The standby attitude indicator is caged. The standby altimeter is set. Electronic interface unit selector is set to auto. Heading switch is normal. FMC selector left. Moving down to the primary ICAS display, and we check the ICAS messages are applicable to the current configuration. We check that the takeoff thrust rating is set properly. The total fuel is cross-checked with our block fuel. Flaps lever up, spoiler lever down, thrust levers idle. The fuel control switches cut off. The radios are set as needed. No smoking and flight deck door selectors set as desired. Seat belts selector to auto. Rudder trim index position 0. And we test the TCAS system. TCAS alerts and displays are checked on both PFD and ND. And the computer voice has confirmed that the TCAS test is passed. And finally, we set the auto brakes to RTO. And this completes the pre-flight flow. In the next video, I will show you the engine start procedures there. Thank you for watching.